Recently, the media reported the news that the United States is negotiating to ease sanctions against Venezuela. But what about democracy? After all, Nicolas Maduro, whom the Americans do not recognize as the president of this country, is still in power. I think it is important to analyze the desire of the USA to soften sanctions against Venezuela in detail, because it is not only a case when proud Americans are ready to back down, but it is also a good example to understand whether Russia will be under sanctions for a long time, or in our case too, the US and the West sooner or later will not stand for it either. Making some concessions and softening. The Venezuelan story began under Trump, who differs from Biden in that he is not as adventurous and prefers to rob small countries. To rob Venezuela, Trump wanted to put Juan Guaido in power to represent US interests in the country and allow US companies to siphon Venezuelan oil for pennies. To help Guaido come to power, the US imposed sweeping sanctions against Venezuela, restricting oil exports from that country and cutting Venezuela's foreign exchange earnings by 99%. The local currency and living standards collapsed, and the Venezuelan opposition, led by Guaido, rushed to blame everything on dictator Maduro. In addition, the Americans organized cyber attacks on Venezuela's infrastructure, leaving the country without light, and Maduro himself tried to attack with drones. As in the case of Russia, the Americans also froze Venezuelan assets totaling about $30 billion, including the assets of Venezuelan officials, and from the side of Colombia, the Americans sent a squad of PMCs for another attempt to liquidate Maduro. All these tests the Venezuelan people and their leader withstood, but the Americans themselves not so much. When the more ambitious Biden came to power, he did not learn any lessons from the events in Venezuela and decided to take a swing at Russia. The US also failed to learn from the years-long confrontation with Iran, which also led nowhere and resulted in the Americans screwing up relations with almost all oil-producing countries and facing oil shortages. Biden's attempt to persuade the Arabs to increase their production did not lead to anything either. And even on the contrary, Biden called the Crown Prince a murderer and threatened to make Saudi Arabia a pariah, thus spoiling relations with the Saudis too. Having spoilt relations with everyone possible, the US began to think about where to get oil, and while Biden was pondering over this issue, the strategic oil reserves of the US began to melt rapidly. Time was running out, and a few months ago, it became known that the US company Chevron had received permission from the US authorities to produce oil in Venezuela, but since Maduro had stood his ground, it was not on terms that would be predatory for Venezuela. Things have slowly started to improve, and Venezuelan exports have started to approach 1 million barrels per day, and next year the authorities hope to double this figure. Moreover, the Americans are offering to ease sanctions. Apart from the Americans, the Europeans are also trying to establish relations with Venezuela, who are also pressed for oil. That year Macron shook hands with Maduro with great respect and called him president at one of the summits where they crossed paths, although the same Macron had previously recognized Juan Guaido as president of Venezuela. This is what oil scarcity does to people, and how it forces them to reconsider their views. Curiously enough, Russian companies also produce oil in Venezuela. Several joint production companies with Venezuelans operate on the territory of this country, and it turns out that by easing sanctions against Venezuela, the US and the West give Russia an opportunity to earn more. Besides, it is no secret that Russian oil is sold above the ceiling officially imposed by the West, and the West not only knows this, but also tacitly transports and insures such oil. Western companies continue to work with Russian Urals oil after its cost has overcome the price ceiling of $60 per barrel set by the G7 countries and the EU. Bloomberg writes, the agency has analysed ships that call at Russian ports in the Baltic and Black Seas, According to Bloomberg, about 40% of them belong to companies from those countries that must comply with the price ceiling. It turns out that the G7 has already tacitly made relaxations for Russia, but for obvious reasons, it is not officially announced anywhere. No one there wants to admit their powerlessness. Therefore, answering the question posed in the article, whether there will be easing of sanctions against Russia, we can safely say that they are already observed. The West has tacitly wavered from its own ceiling and is negotiating the easing of sanctions against Venezuela, where Russian companies produce oil. Of course, the West will never lift all sanctions, but they will not achieve anything significant. But this is not all the conclusions that can be drawn from this story. I would like to say separately about OPEC's behavior. I think each of the participants, using the example of Venezuela or Russia, has assessed and weighed the prospects of their country. If the US administration in the future comes up with the idea of doing something similar to their country, Americans do what they do. They find some algorithm of actions that worked once and just repeat it. And if it worked in Venezuela or with Russia, the United States would definitely do the same with other oil-producing countries. That's why I think that the OPEC countries' reduction of oil production was aimed not only at stabilizing oil prices in their own interests, but also at getting the Americans to start easing sanctions against Russia and Venezuela. I guess it's something of a collective reciprocity between OPEC countries, because otherwise other countries would be next. By the way, there was no such unity before, and for example, the Iranians fought US sanctions for a long time in proud solitude, as did the North Koreans, and Russia even complied with some Western sanctions. Not surprisingly, the Americans often succeeded in staging a coup in one country or another, because what can a small country do against the hegemon alone? This is how Libya, Yugoslavia, and other countries fell. But now a lot has changed, and in Venezuela, Russia's active participation was not left out, thanks to which Maduro survived, and at once, somehow the Americans did not do well with coups. The West tries to explain their unsuccessful attempts in a very amusing way. For example, Baerbock, trying to explain why sanctions against Russia do not work, recently issued the following: "The logic of democracies does not work in autocracies." What she meant by this is hard to understand, but in my opinion, the point is simply that the whole world is tired of the collective West, and many countries have begun to unite and together successfully oppose it.